Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for showing up and those that are about to do so as well. My name is Alex Pedham. I'm the executive assistant at Y4Y Québec. For those of you that aren't as familiar with us, we're a youth-led nonprofit that's committed to addressing the issues facing English-speaking youth all across the province. We define youth as being between the ages of 16 to 30. So like with events like these tonight, we seek to increase a sense of community and belonging amongst this official language minority, as well as increasing their levels of civic engagement. This is done through the productions through various means, so policy briefs, projects, our upcoming youth forum in Quebec City, and various organizational partnerships. So my project is called the Youth Town Hall Project. So funded by Canadian Heritage, this enables us to hold nonpartisan public conversations on the topic of the recently tabled Law 96, or an act representing French, the official and common language of Quebec. So 3 of Y4Y's 4 youth town hall events have been held through a hybrid format in first St. Paul's River in the North Shore, Chicoutimi in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, and more recently last month in January in Chibougamau, which is in Le Nord du Québec. That is the name of the administrative region. So tonight, this evening, we're holding the final virtual wrap-up session. So high schools, CEGEPs, and universities have been indispensable in promoting Y4Y's town halls. So in sum, tonight, and with this project before, we hope to inform and facilitate respectful conversations between the English and the French-speaking communities on Law 96. So tonight, we're going to hear from 2 fascinating speakers. First, and he's first on my screen here, Éducaloi's Gregory Landcop will walk us through how we got here since Bill 101, and how Law 96 will affect English-speaking youth, primarily in the context of CEGEPs. There will be a 15-minute mid-session Q&A period at that point. We'll conclude with a second speaker, Erica de Torres from Apathy is Boring, who's addressing other ways that youth can increase their civic engagement. Once the event is over, I'll be sending you all an email with links to relevant resources based on what the sort of things we've been discussing were tonight. So this event is being recorded. I can't see all your screens right now, but don't hesitate to turn off your cameras if that's what you'd prefer. But otherwise, of course, it's always nice to see your faces. We've had Zoom for years. We know the drill. I do know that this can be a fairly emotional topic. So don't refrain from asking your questions, but I'd ask that the questions directed at Gregory, at his presentation, they stay on topic and they stay civil, and ideally they stay short too, because we only have 15 minutes. You're welcome to send questions to info@y4yquebec.org afterwards if we don't get the chance to get to yours. And if Gregory's all right with it too, maybe send a few follow-up questions to his email that he can, if you'd like to share afterwards. He's nodding, so I think that's an option. So Éducaloi is also a non-partisan organization, so his answers will have to remain fairly neutral and stick to the details of the law itself. Fellow Y4Y board members will answer questions if they arise that kind of fall outside of the purview of his presentation and his organization. My last request, I'd ask that your Zoom names be names that you're comfortable having me shout out. If it's numbers, they'll just get a little complicated. And apologies in advance for the mispronunciations, etc. I will likely do so, and I'm sorry. As usual, I'd say use the raise hand function. I'll unmute you to the best of my abilities in the order that you arose. Just if you don't mind closing, thank you, Kayla. Okay, so let me introduce our first speaker that we've heard so much about, Gregory Landcop. Gregory conceives of and writes legal material for the general public as what's called a plain language specialist. So a member of the Barreau du Québec since 2016. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science with a minor in history from the University of Ottawa, a bachelor's of law from the Université Laval, and a master's in business law from the University of Montreal. Before joining Éducaloi, Gregory worked in private practice, mainly in business law, and completed several internships in federal departments, notably in Global Affairs Canada. So without further ado, Gregory, the floor is yours. Oh,
Thank you very much for your kind words. I'll wait for maybe the PowerPoint to be ready, then we can get started.
so do you see it, or do you just see the loading bar? Great.
For the time being, it's only saying loading, but
Still saying loading, eh? Okay. I
no.
will- How about that? Nice.
Great. I think we can get started. So thanks very much, Alex. As we're maybe going to look at a bit before Bill 101, because I'm basically going to give a large overtext, but I don't want to steal the punch of the presentation. So as you're all aware, I'll be presenting the language laws in Quebec, an overview of Bills 96 in 101. So to understand Bill 96, one must understand Bill 101. I don't want to go to much of detail already. That'll be later on in my presentation. So let's get started. So next slide. So here's the general presentation outline for today. I'm going to present it briefly. I know Alex already talked a bit of who we are, Éducaloi, but I want to all the same present maybe who we are. And like I myself, I'm Gregory Lankop. I guess as Alex said, I'm a lawyer and a plain language specialist at Éducaloi. After presenting Éducaloi, we'll be looking at what is Bill 101, because it's the foundations of what came after, so Bill 96. And then we'll look at Bill 96 itself and what does it change concretely in your lives. So yeah, so we're at part one, Éducaloi. Next slide. I could probably go through this quickly, but I think Alex already resumed it pretty well. We're a nonprofit organization, so that means we're not governmental. We're not directly affiliated with the federal or provincial governments. We founded in the year 2000, so it's already been 23 years. Time flies. And our goal is to make the law more accessible to Quebecers in giving them reliable legal information in clear, everyday language. And this is also done to develop their legal skills. So it comes into part, at least with my presentation today. We are about a team of 35 lawyers and notaries, so people who work in the legal field, as well as other specialists in communications and in technology specialists. We have different communication tools, which I'll show you in the next slide. But we're best known for our website, which you see the link right up here. We have on our website, we have over 1,000, we have 1,200 articles and videos in English and French on different topics, such as, which we'll look at later, language laws. As you see here as well, we have an Instagram page as well. So we talk about different legal questions that might affect you on a day-to-day basis. And it's something to be consulted as well. And we also have a Facebook page, and we have different news stories we talk about, and we explain it in plain language on a legal in a legal manner, because the law is everywhere, we often forget. But even coming, maybe today you took the bus or the metro, you bought a ticket, well, that's a contract, right? So that's basically to make you realize that law is everywhere, and like even the right to go to school, well, it's touched by the law, right? So without further ado, let's get started into the subject matter today. What is Bill 101? Before getting started, I want to give a bit of a historical context, because Bill 101 does not come out of a vacuum. There's a certain history behind it. After this contextualization, I know you're mostly here to know how that touches you, right now in 2023, but I think it's important all the same to understand where this comes from and like the evolution behind the law itself. And also I'm a history buff before, as you heard the presentation about me, I like history, so it's a joy. Next slide. So here's a picture of Lester B. Pearson, who was the Prime Minister of Canada in the 60s. I'm gonna get back to him in a second. So in 1867, we all know Canada became a country. We got very large brushes right now. At that time, the only province in Canada that was bilingual was Quebec. This was generally the case into the 1960s, where things started to change in Quebec and elsewhere in Canada, and there's different linguistic dynamics. So in the 1960s, starting from 1963 to 71, Lester B. Pearson, the Prime Minister of Canada at that time, created a Royal Commission. You will find it rather odd, the name, but it has a historical meaning. Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. So it's even before the idea of multicultural came into the mind of a lot of Canadians. So this commission addressed, among other things, linguistic grievances. So at that time, a couple of years later, well, during the time of the mandate of the commission, you had the New Brunswick that was the only province, the province with the highest linguistic duality became officially bilingual in 1969. And at the same time, a couple of months later, the federal government became bilingual following the recommendations of the commission itself. So next slide. So what we see here was, I want the federal government in the province of New Brunswick was addressing in its way the reality of the French language in its jurisdiction, I guess. But at the same time, Quebec had its own measures, if I can say so, to address the linguistic question, rather. So in 1969, you had Bill 63, which is, I think, was one of the first, if not the first, language law in Quebec. So it's an act to promote the French language. So Bill 63, it was under the Union Nationale government. So basically what it did was required immigrants to already have a working knowledge of French when coming to Quebec. In 1974, the Official Language Act came into place. So we saw earlier New Brunswick became officially bilingual in 1969. So Quebec became unilingual French in 1974 under the Robert Bourassa's government. The new law required also new arrivals to Quebec, immigrant people, to enroll in French school unless they demonstrate a certain, were able to demonstrate sufficient knowledge of French, English rather. And in 1976 rather, the Quebec government adopted a new law called Bill 101 that came into force in 1977. So the Charter of the French Language. And it was introduced by Camille Lorrain, one of the ministers. Next slide. So now we have historical context behind us. We can get started in the nitty-gritty, I guess you can say. The law has been in place since 1977 and was reformed by Bill 96 in 2022. So like I said earlier at the beginning of the presentation, to understand Bill 96, one must understand Bill 101. Bill 96 basically changes the law that was already in place, but Bill 101 still exists. So it's a reform, if you will, of the law in place. So Bill 101 makes French the official language of the government and law, as well as work, education, business, and other communications. One of the things it does, it makes gives consumers the right to be informed and served in French. And next slide. It also has different requirements in signage. For example, the general rule is that public signs and commercial advertising must be in French. Another language can indeed appear, so often the other language is English. So long as the French is clearly predominant. So that's the general rule, but I'm a lawyer, I like exceptions, and there are exceptions. There are certain circumstances where French does not have to be predominant, okay? For example, public sign regarding public health or safety can be in both French and another language, the other language being, of course, English, provided that the French is equally as predominant as the other language, okay? And even circumstances signage could be unilingual English. This might be the case, for example, for science announcing conference aimed at a specific or a limited group. So another thing that's touched upon is the right to work in French. All workers have the right to work in French in Quebec. They can speak and write in French, and they cannot be fired or refuse a job because they don't know English or another language well enough. There are exceptions, however, where an employer can require knowledge of English. And indeed, it can be like we've all applied for different jobs, and we've seen like French, we see bilingual. Well, someone has to be bilingual. An example of this would be a call center that does many calls to clients in the United States. An employer clearly needs someone who speaks English, right? So that's an exception where we don't have to, where we can require knowledge of another language. There's also Bill 101 creates something called francization, which is basically at the time it was adopted in 1977. It changes under Bill 96, but francization of rules for companies of 50 employees or more. Basically, francization requires that French be the usual language used in business activities. For example, internal, external communications. The Office of the French Language wants to make sure that the French language is used in a sufficient amount, which is very, I know it sounds rather subjective. I'm not going to be able to define it easily because it's not a very easy thing to define. English or other languages can be used as long as French is present in the office as well. Like in communications, one can have internal communications in, for example, English, so long as a French version is available as well. And finally, packaging must normally in French. Yet again, packaging can have another version in another language as well. So bilingual packaging, so long as it's of equal provenance. So basically 50-50. So the text is not smaller in French, is not smaller than the text in English, for example. In fact, furthermore, if you're interested in looking at different things on signage, I know maybe the nitty-gritty for you is a bit later, but next slide. Here's one of our tools we offer, and it resumes, I guess, gives a good explanation of what the main rules for signage is. And the exceptions are not shown on this slide, but basically like where French has to be of equal value as English or another language, or where it has to be bigger. So for example, we see signs as French is bigger, but the English language text can still be there. Exactly. So the next slide, we're going to look at something more close to home, I guess, for everyone, for the person attending our presentation today. So Bill 101, as we saw earlier, the Bill 22 said people could attend English schools so long as they had shown sufficient knowledge of English. So Bill 101 changed that. So Bill 101 makes it so that only in certain circumstances, independent of their knowledge of English, that they must attend a French-speaking school, unless certain circumstances are in play. For example, one of the parents received his or her elementary school in English, or elementary or secondary school in English, as well as brothers and sisters in the same circumstance. If one of the parents attended English school in Canada, they have the right to go to English school in Quebec, because Quebec is a Canadian province, so of course it makes sense. And it's also not surprising, as the Canadian Constitution also recognizes that citizens of Canada of whom any one of the parents attended an English school, well, the children can also go to went to school in English, they can also go to school in English. When I say a school, of course I'm talking about primary and secondary school, because as of right now, this doesn't touch CEGEP, even before Bill 96. There are also several other exceptions I didn't touch upon. For example, children living temporarily in Quebec, like for example, there are temporary work visa. This is maybe one of the exceptions where they can attend English school. And also different rules for Indigenous language communities as well. So they're exempt from these requirements as well. Next slide. So what is Bill 96 and what does it change? So it came into effect June 1st, 2022. Here you have a picture of the minister who presented the law and was adopted. You have also the premier of Quebec, François Legault. I say it came into effect in June 1st, 2022. I say in part. Why do I say in part? Because some parts of the law come into play later. So September 1st, 2022, and there's other things, other conditions that come into to effect later on, which we will see as well. So yes, indeed, the law is already, the Chart of the French language is already changed, but there are other requirements will come into play in the years coming to 2025. It's the first major reform of the Chart of the French language since 1977. And the stated purpose behind the law is to affirm that the only official language of Quebec is French and to encourage its use. Next slide. So for a lot of people, it's fine. Like we explained Bill 101. I think maybe you already knew sufficiently enough about Bill 101. So we might be asking, what has changed? What has not changed, rather? Before going to what has changed, one has to know what has not changed, right? So access to primary and secondary school has not changed. So what we saw just now has not changed. If you were able to go to English school before Bill 96, you can still go to English school after Bill 96. No formal restrictions to apply to CEGEP in English. So there are still, the Minister of Higher Education does control the places allowed in English CEGEP. I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty because there's calculation and demographics and like how many places are allowed in the CEGEPs. But if someone went to an English school, or rather a French primary or secondary school, or they can still apply to CEGEP. They will not be denied for the sole reason that they went to primary or secondary school in French. So CEGEP is still open to the public, independent of the language of study before college education. So college being CEGEP. Signage and packaging can still also be in English. So we looked at earlier, has not changed. There is a slight modifications on trademarks, but I don't think anyone here is very interested in trademarks. So I'm not going to go into that. I do like trademarks, but to each their own, I guess. And that's be later on, it'd be 2025. So it's not yet in place. And English still can be used at work. So communications between superiors, I'll look at that later on in the presentation, where you're still allowed to use English at work. Maybe even in your, I don't want to steal the punch, I'll wait later on. So next slide. So a big question for a lot of people, and I felt important to discuss it. What does Bill 96 change with respect to CEGEP? So it talks about in the law collegial education, but call spade a spade, it's CEGEP. So starting from the school year 2024-25, 3 French classes in CEGEP will be required. Okay, so that it's not yet in place. So if you're presently in CEGEP, you won't be affected by this normally. There's also another requirement that comes into play, if I'm not mistaken, it's school year 2023-24. Sufficient knowledge of French will be required to graduate. What is sufficient knowledge of French? It means it basically means to have be able to interact. This is the words of the law: to interact, thrive within Quebec society, and participate in its development. How that will be interpreted, we don't know yet. We will see. As such, yet again, with regards to the 3 classes in CEGEP in 2024-25, if you are presently enrolled in CEGEP, you can still receive your diploma. That's one of the things that it's specified in the law. Students enrolled before 2023-24 are not required to meet this threshold of sufficient knowledge of French. Next slide. So Bill 96 makes a point. This maybe if you talk to your go to a hospital or you want to talk to the government for any questions, well, this will have an impact. Language of the civil administration. So the law says exclusive use of French with the public with certain exceptions. Okay, and that will come into place. Like I said, the bill already came into law in 2022, but this is one of the things that comes into play a bit later, so June 2023. And it's very important to talk about the exceptions. So this Quebec government must make exemplary use of the French language, but the exceptions are where public health, public safety, or other principles of natural justice are required. So that means basically going to your doctor, wherever you have still the right to speak English. It's not been touched by Bill 96. So that is still in play. Also, I say historically English-speaking community, it's not the best way of simplifying what the law says. The law says if you have the right to go to school in English in Quebec, school being primary, secondary school in English, you have the right to also communicate with the Quebec government in English as well. Another exception is new arrivals still can communicate with the Quebec government in a language other than French up to 6 months. So that's another thing. After 6 months, the expectation is that new arrivals will have to start speaking French to the government, but yet again, how that would be translated, I guess, is yet to be seen. Next slide. So the law, what it's done in workplace, the additions to the law is more. The way it's written is that new rules to prevent discrimination against French-speaking workers. So what the law says is every employer shall respect the worker's right to carry on his activities in French, and there cannot be any dismissals, layoffs, demotions, or reprisals against this employee because for the sole reason that the member is exclusively French-speaking or does not have sufficient knowledge of a given language. Yet again, like I said, to hold a position, sometimes employers, if they do the demonstration that they have a requirement to speak English, well, this is to be taken into account. But the fact that someone wants to work in French, we cannot punish them for that. Yet again, like I spoke to earlier, francisation is that a process that basically the companies have to register with the Office of the French Language and to demonstrate the sufficient use of the French language at work. Well, it's no longer 50 employees, it will be 25 or more. But yet again, that's coming in 2025. It's not yet in place, not yet in law. And yet again, I think it's important to talk about the exceptions. The employer may communicate in writing or orally with a worker exclusively in another language than French, if the latter has so requested. So basically, if an employee asks to be communicated in writing or orally by his employer in English, this can be done. It's English not banned in the workplace. An individual employment contract may be drawn exclusively in another language than French if both parties wish to do so. So, for example, your employer is more comfortable with English, you are as well. You can have your contract written up in English, signed in English. Even every association of workers may use the language of an individual if this individual so makes a request. Yet again, if basically I think would be understanding is a union. So if you, as an employee, a union member asked to be addressed in English directly between you and the Association of Workers, well, that can be done as well. So, and yet again, like I said earlier, that English can still be required in certain circumstances at work. Like imagine, like I said, you're working with a large community of English speakers in the United States or in other provinces, it can definitely be required. But yet again, in the job description, the employer has to demonstrate why the use of English or another language is required. I think that went rather quick. I have next slide. So what I talked about, we've been talking about earlier, is the different he's not talking. Basically, here's the articles. We resume what I've been talking about since earlier today, since 6 o'clock. So here are the articles that we have on our website: our Child of French language, health and social services. Like I said, talking with your government, language laws and doing business in Quebec, access to English schools. These are articles on our website. And they've been made up to date since the adoption of Bill 96. Next slide. To access these articles, what you do is you simply go on our main page, you click on the law by topic, and then you scroll down to rights and government, and here you see the articles I so mentioned. And I think, Alex, I gave you the links as well. So I think, of my understanding, you'll be sent them out. If you're interested in knowing more, the participants, you have access to these articles, and of course other articles on different subjects that might interest you. Next slide. And we do also, like I said earlier, we have articles, yes, but we have other tools, namely this one, which I've been told, it's been on the website since the last week, and it talks about, like, if, I don't know, you decide to go into business, what kind of requirements that you have to follow, basically with regards to signage or brochures or catalogs. And I think that's about it. Thank you very much for your time. It flew, and that's about it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much, Gregory. Let me just close all this. Okay, so yeah, now I would open the floor to questions. So like I said, topic, civil, fairly short. We're running a little late on time, so yeah, people want to start raising their hands with the function. I'll start picking people from the crowd. Thank you.
Alex, can I interrupt you? We did have a couple of questions, 2 short questions that were posted in the chat by Amanda, and I told her that we would address them. I think they're perfect for Greg.
Perfect.
Greg, I don't know if you can see the chat, and then I see Charlene's hand up. I also see, is that Verity's hand up? Hold on. Monica, Charlene, and then Monica following Amanda, please. So Amanda, if you wanted to ask them, or if you would like Alex, shall Alex read your questions to Greg?
I can read Amanda's questions.
Thank you.
Okay, question 1. So children attending English school, is that only if their parents attended English school, or does it work for grandparents as well?
That's a very good question. I can look at that right now, because off the top of my head, I know it's the parents, and I can actually open up my PowerPoint. Maybe I have the notes right here. Normally I should. It's a very good question, because it's, as I recall, I think there's a grandparent clause to it. It's not just the parents itself. I didn't want to go into the nitty-gritty, because it is it says a child is a parent, educated citizen received to be frank, a child whose mother or father attended after and his parents could have declared. Okay, so it says, and his parents could have been declared eligible for English. So if it says if the parents can be declared eligible, therefore that goes also to the grandparents. So that's one of the questions. The second question was, how many years does the individual need to attend English school going forward to be able to attend their, that's a very technical question that I can't speak to, sadly. I think from my understanding, it's the majority of their education, but I'm not going to swear upon that. The third question is I can see is, can a student attend primary school in French and secondary school in English and be able to educate? So yet again, like have they met the requirement? The law says has received his or elementary school, secondary school, most of. So if they done most of their schooling, independent of like if your grandparents were able to go to English school, you did half and half. Normally your children, from my understanding of the law, can also go to English school.
Okay, thank you. Adrian, I didn't get to see all the hand raising in order. I think you mentioned Charlene is next. I'm not
Hi,
mistaken.
Charlene.
So go right ahead.
You're
Sorry.
next, and then we'll go to Monica. I think Caleb's going to help us with this too, Alex. So I'll be quiet. Caleb will help. I saw Charlene's hand first, then Monica, and then Raul.
Perfect.
Well,
Thank
then I'm taking the lead.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Greg, from Éducaloi. Wonderful organization, very informative so far. What we've talked about this evening, kind of like a two-part question. You can answer which one you feel most comfortable with.
Perfect.
When we talk about as historical Anglophones, that we would have access still to the Quebec government in English. But if I'm not mistaken, there are exemptions to that, being like the CNSST, what I would have called the CSST, workman's comp. Apparently we can't get access there. And if you would care to venture into describing what French being more prominent means. You know, traditionally we thought that meant double in size or bigger letters, but if you would like to address that. Thank you very much, Greg.
So I can maybe talk to, it's a very good question what you mentioned. I'm going to look at what the law says. I think that's the only way I can really go about it. But as I understood in the way it's written, is that the Quebec government must use exemplary use of the French language. And when it says about communications, one of the things is that one of the exceptions is people who have access to English schooling normally have access to communication with the government in English. So I can maybe there's certain exceptions that I'm not aware of, but I can definitely check up on my end and maybe get back to you. I don't want to say falsehoods. Especially as a lawyer, I think that would be not good on me. Respecting the signage, I know I'm certain there's maybe jurisprudence, maybe the Office of the French Language has specific guidance with regards to what's significantly different. I'm maybe not going to pull out a ruler to basically show the difference, but it's I'm rather disappointed I'm not able to give you a very easy answer, because it's not an easy answer to address.
Okay, then I have Monica next. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi there.
Hi.
I have more of a comment than a question.
Sounds good.
So I am someone that lives with a disability, and I find it's getting harder and harder to get services. Like even like say working with the CLSC, I've asked for forms in English and they say they cannot provide it. Or if I go to a store and I'm looking for a product, I have trouble seeing, and having French bigger than English makes it difficult to find products.
So I know, like I said, on packaging, normally it's supposed to be 50-50-ish, but I know I think I can understand how the signage can be have an impact, and I'm sorry to hear that. I can only say it must be very hard. So I'm very
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's just something that I'm trying to advocate for.
Monica, thank you for your comment. My name is Adrienne. I'm the director at Y4Y Québec. And what we spend the majority of our time doing with our organization is outreach and consultation with particularly the youth demographic within our English speaking community. But we often end up speaking to individuals of all stripes, from all regions, of all age groups, etc., and all backgrounds. And we include those comments that we receive during our consultations in the reporting that we do to people in places of decision-making power. And your comment will be included in that as well. They're all important, and it's not the first time that we've heard someone who lives with a certain set of circumstances that experiences these things in a particular way. So thank you for sharing, and it's well noted.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah, it's really interesting.
thank you. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. Raul, you're up next.
Hello. Well, I'd like to start thank you for doing this and helping others understand the new changes. I personally am very excited about this new change because I strongly believe that French must be protected in our province, and there is no other official language other than French here. So I'm very happy and excited about this change. My question is, it regards contracts. I noticed you mentioned something about contracts. So the new one says that they can still be in English language.
Yeah.
A common way to bypass our law like currently is to send a contract in English, and then one paragraph, tiny paragraph, is going to be typically is in italics. You'll find that there's like a disclaimer that you're accepting that all the communication is going to be in English language. I personally, I inquired about this, and it's not, I mean, it's a gray zone. Apparently it's a gray zone, but more of something that is not legal. Would this be different with the new, well, first of all, is it really not legal? And is this going to be better or worse once we have our grade law of passed, right? Our bill.
So first, the bill has already passed, but like I said, like the entry into law, certain parts of the law it's an odd way of saying, I'm sorry, but like it's still coming to play. What I think what I hear in your question is what's the an actual acceptance?
Exactly.
Ultimately,
What is okay and what's not okay?
Yeah, because like ultimately one can argue that they're never really accepted to do it to begin with, right? So I without giving a legal opinion, because I can't give you legal advice.
No, I mean, just
But-
I mean, you're just what we see right now is like specifically a lot of people from Indian, and I don't want to mention like specific cultures or whatever, but we're going to see that in specific domains as well, right? IT, and we send it's a contract being sent in English, and then tiny characters in French, just making sure you're agreeing, but it's a way of bypassing what's currently protecting us. So is this going to be, what's the change in terms of contracts in general? Like,
so I'm not necessarily aware of a particular changes that touches specifically on that question. I can, however, say that one could question, like, does it respect the spirit of the law? Because often what a lawyer will look at is what's the intention of the law. And I would wonder if that's really the intention of the law. If is it being bypassed? That we say in law that we cannot do indirectly what we cannot do directly. So I'm wondering if, I'm not certain on the matter, but I would question if that would be legitimate. But if, yet again, like if both parties decide to write the contract in English, you still have that right to do so, right? So it's yet again the question of is that their real intention? But that's another question entirely. I'm sorry if it's rather vague, my response, but
no, that's fine.
okay.
Yeah, or
Thank
the
you,
OQLF, they will be able to provide information as well, I guess.
Sorry to cut you off there, Raul. Yeah, so time is running a little tight. I will have to cut it there. I've gotten one or two private questions, like DM questions. I'm gonna have to put those aside for now. I'll forward them to Gregory. She's happy to. And I think I will pass the floor to our second speaker, to Erica de Torres. While you set up, I'll just give a brief little introduction. So Erica is the Impact and Development Director at Apathy is Boring. Their pronouns are she, they. Erica immigrated from the Philippines to Canada when they were 6, becoming a Canadian citizen when they were 10. So since then, Erica developed a great interest in Canadian democracy and participates as much as they can. They completed an MA in political science at McGill University, and a BA in political science from Simon Fraser University. Their MA research examined whether or not place of residence affects an individual's political preferences in Canada. They worked in higher education as a teaching assistant, a research assistant, and supported a variety of academic departments. So the floor is yours, Erica. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction. And also thank you, Greg, for that really informative session. I know we are at 6:49 and I'm super mindful of people's time, so I won't keep you all for too long. My presentation is going to be on youth-led democratic innovation and the next steps for youth looking to get more involved in democracy. So to start off, I just wanted to quickly acknowledge that ASB, Apathy is Boring, is in Georgiage, which is situated on the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, which is a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst many First Nations, including the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Anishinaabeg. And we further acknowledge that this is the very first step towards reconciliation, and as a settler democracy-driven organization are continually reflecting on how we can further support the TRC's 94 calls to action. So who are we? ASB was founded in 2004 by a group of 3 friends who noticed that the people around them weren't participating in democracy. And what they ended up doing was applying for a government grant to start their very first voter engagement initiative. And from there, ASB has grown from a very small team of 3 to present day 27, and has grown in programs that span, voter engagement to civic education to community engagement. So lots of different things, all in support of supporting, educating, and advocating for young people to participate in Canada's democracy. And while we do so, we are very nonpartisan. So that means we don't share any views that are similar to any party. And we make sure that when we're talking about the issues, we very much stick to the facts. And this is just a really cute photo of our team, which for the first time since the pandemic, we were able to gather from all across Canada in the old port of Montreal to do our very first staff gathering. And thank you so much, Alex, for the introduction. I won't introduce myself to cut on time. And so for today's session, my agenda going through is what is the context when it comes to youth engagement and democracy, and what are ways to get involved? So my intention and hope is that for all of you to think and reflect on ways that you can get involved, or if you're already involved, how you're involved in relation to our engagement framework, which is called the Youth-Led Democratic Innovation Framework. So with that said, I'm jumping right into it. Big question is youth participation in politics really on the decline? And what we're seeing, and there's a graph here, and I'll chat about it in a little bit, but our research has told us that the trust in institution is quite low amongst younger demographics, especially for marginalized youth. And according to a poll in 2020, only 53% of Canadians trust institutions, which include the media, the government. So it's apparent that there's a dissolution of trust amongst mainstream society, and not just amongst young people. And we further believe that young people have an interest in politics, but feel alienated from the democratic process, as it's common to feel powerless and ignored when trying to engage in the political system beyond voting. And truly at ASB, what we think of this is that there's more of an issue of barriers to participation. And instead, it's a crisis of political culture. Now that's not to say that there aren't immense barriers to participation, because they certainly do exist. And through our research, we're noticing that there isn't necessarily a decline in overall political engagement among youth, but a shift. So that said, something to reflect on, I'd love to know in the chat if any of these reasons for barriers resonate with you. So for example, in 2020, we did a survey amongst 3,000 young people all across Canada about their reasons for not voting in the federal election. As you can see, 59% of young people said between the ages of 18 to 30 that it was primarily motivational reasons. So they didn't trust candidates. They couldn't decide on who to vote for. There was no interest in voting. They didn't necessarily like politics, didn't like to vote, cynical, or lazy, or forgot. While as 26% were barriers, which meant that they had no time, they were sick, they were out of town, couldn't get a ride, or didn't receive a voting card. And recently in 2022, from my own interest in municipal government and elections, we surveyed another 2,000 young people from all across Canada about their reasons for not voting in municipal elections. And for the most part, a lot of young people had said they weren't eligible to vote, or they don't follow municipal politics, or don't believe that the vote matters too much, physically unable to vote amongst in the last election. None of the candidates spoke to me. None of the issues were important to me, and didn't know how to vote, and didn't believe that municipal politics impacted them. So as you can see, from the 2020 survey to the survey that's more specific to municipal elections, some of the themes for not voting were quite similar. And yeah, like I said, in our research, what we're noting isn't necessarily a shift or a decline in overall political engagement among young people, but a shift. So what our research suggests is that youth are opting to engage in more community-based, non-institutional, and social movement-oriented forms of engagement. So thinking about the Fridays for the Future marches, thinking about the petitions that you can access online. And the shift from formal to informal methods of participation means that young people like ourselves are underrepresented in traditional institutions like the government, for example, but are overrepresented in decentralized social movements like Black Lives Matter, the climate movements, the March for Our Lives, and all of these types of movements. But the thing is, a lot of the research out there doesn't necessarily capture the shift, because there's not really a lot of effort being made to highlight the entire ecosystem of youth engagement. Instead, there's more of a focus on fixed and traditional methods of engagement, such as voter turnout, which has been steadily declining amongst youth since the mid-90s, and overall as well. So not just youth. And this isn't to say that young people are getting apolitical. It's more to say that we're participating and engaging in different ways. And they're truthfully, as someone who tries to evaluate these things, they're pretty hard to quantify in easy numbers. So it sucks, but it's unfortunate. But the truth is the numbers don't really tell the entire story. So what we think is that there isn't a decline in engagement, but there is a shift. So does that mean that we're apathetic? And no. What we're constantly seeing in our research is that there is apathy towards the process, not the issues, which means that many of you in this call right now likely have issues that you care about. On a personal note for myself, I care deeply about food insecurity and its impact. And how do we bring food insecurity in conversation and engagement with democracy? So like I said, most academic research doesn't necessarily touch on informal ways of participation, which is just as valid as formal models, like voting or writing to your elected officials, which, fun fact, it is completely free for you to send snail mail to your elected member of parliament. And it's important to consider that we as young people are extremely diverse, and arguably the most diverse generation in Canada right now. And the roles that we play vary between experiences, time, and issues when it comes to participating in democracy. So we're not necessarily participating in traditional models. We are, but as the numbers have shown, voter engagement is lower. But with that said, when we think about the different ways that the diverse youth that are in this call right now, youth like myself, can participate in democracy, we see that there's three different major components and major roles that we can play. So what I ask of you for this chat and for this call is to think about how you as an individual are doing these types of roles in your day-to-day lives when participating in democracy, or when participating in your school, in your workplace. So shakers are the folks who point out the problems, structural inequalities, and generally make noise on the ground. Makers or innovators focus on developing solutions to the problems pointed out by the shakers, so often at a community-based level. And then our uptakers have decision-making power, finances, or social capital to take those ideas to scale in order to create and enact long-term systems change. When you're looking at this, the thing is, when you have one without the other, it doesn't really work as well. So for example, shakers without makers, you're hearing a lot of people's voices on the ground, but there's no ways forward. So there's a lot of frustrations. Now, if you have makers without uptakers, you have a lot of really great ideas, but there's no buy-in to create that long-term impact and outcomes to be produced. And uptakers without community input and direction results in what we view as a broken democracy. And like I said, for the previous slides, think about some of the roles that you might have played. And what we've done at ASB to develop some of our programs is improved it through our youth-led democratic innovation and really build on it. Because what we view is that young people like yourselves lead through a combination of different empowering roles. And at any given time, you are in between one, or you are one, or you're in between all of them. So what we see is that participation is empowered in a creative process that moves along a spectrum between different forms and intensifies of engagement. So this accounts for how youth participation is multi-layered and dynamic, and it changes over time in response to context and culture. So what we didn't want to put any hierarchy to it, and we didn't believe that any individual has a low barrier action and necessarily needs to go up the ladder to a high barrier action. Instead, what we see is that young people are drawing on multiple forms of participation to yield different outcomes depending on the context. So I'd love for you to think about and reflect what you have done lately that might fit into some of these roles. So for example, youth as movement leaders are shakers who focus on direct and collective action, instigating public debate and dialogue around an issue or process. This can include digital participation, like signing a petition online in its various forms, or in person through protest. And and often the intention is to draw attention to an issue. This can be partisan or ideologically based, but really the focus is on bringing awareness and education around the ways to be informed and engage with issues and facilitate transitions to the other roles, which is the next one, including the youth as creative organizers, where young people utilize their skills, network, and creativity towards their own projects or initiatives. So this includes youth-led organizations, for example, Y4Y or Apathy is Boring, creating projects as well as initiatives that are co-developed between youth and older adults for intergenerational learning. And the focus here is on developing solutions that address the issues that concern them. So one example is through our RISE program, where young people develop their skills and networks to create projects around issues that they care about. So for example, bringing back my example about food security, one of the projects over in Winnipeg created a community fridge as well as a guide on how to make a community fridge in your community, which I thought was really, really cool. And finally, there is the youth as decision maker, where young people occupy roles that allow them to make meaningful decisions that impact themselves, their peers, and communities. This requires a shift between a patronage model, which presumes that young people need to be guided into a power where power is shared, mutual, and reciprocal. And the focus is on the ability for us as young people to make decisions, to have a potential for long-term and systemic impact through participation. And I know that there's a pretty cool project in the pipeline for Y4Y that I feel really passionate about, where we're bringing more young people into board of director positions, for example. So something to look out for there. And so with that said, there's so many different ways to get involved with just those roles themselves. So thinking about how you have done, how you have been a youth as movement leader, or youth as creative organizers, or youth as decision maker. Going to speed through this, but as a youth-led democratic organization, what we hope to do is bring different programs that really are low barrier for you to get engaged and involved in. And obviously we are just one organization, so this list is definitely not exhaustive and really speaking from our own experiences. But if you are interested, we have a bunch of different programs. First, starting off with the feed, which is our bi-weekly newsletter. So if you're interested in learning more about Canadian democracy and want to get it in your email bi-weekly in very bite-sized, digestible, digestible way, sign up for the feed. It is completely free and it's a lot of fun to read, and everything is linked to the proper resources and websites for you to learn more about. And we just got out of a really, really busy election period last year. Our voter engagement vote was extremely busy, activating young people from across Canada in municipal elections, provincial elections, and the federal election. And what ways that you can get involved there is by helping us table in events, participating in our different panel events, telling your friends about how to vote, providing and resharing our resources. And we also have Table Topics, which is our brunch where we invite youth panelists from across Canada to talk about their experiences in Canadian democracy, and invite all of you to come join us for brunch, where we have discussions on issues and topics around civic engagement, participating in your community. And if you have a little bit more time, we have our RISE program, which is funded by the Canada Service Corps, where we, like I mentioned before, take young people who don't necessarily have a lot of experience and help build up their skills and networks to create a community project. So I said the community project that was based in Winnipeg. One of our really big projects in Montreal was in cohort 2 called Je suis Montréal. And it was a picture project which featured diverse young people from across Montreal and told their stories and connected with other young people, which is really cool. And one of the really cool programs that we have and started just last year is called Build. So if you're interested and have an issue that you want to advocate for, this program helps you build your networks, help you build your actionable civic knowledge in order to advocate for issues that you care about. So one specific issue that one youth actually came with in their university was around having more accessibility for people who had guide dogs in their to have the guide dogs able to go into universities with people who needed them. So that is Build, and Build is actually accepting applications right now. And obviously want to give a shout out to Y4Y, who has a lot of different volunteer opportunities. I just checked out their website. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of really cool events. So please do continue your journey with Y4Y as well as ASB. So I leave you with this in terms of reflection. What are ways that you want to start or continue to engage in civics and democracy in your day-to-day? And that is it. So if you have any questions, I'd love to chat. My email's right here. It's just my name, erica@apathysboring.com.
Okay, amazing. Well, thank you, Erica, and thank you, Craig, for these excellent presentations. Like I said, I'm going to send you all follow-up emails that include the presenters' emails, including the resources that Erica just mentioned, as well as those that Greg also listed at the end of his presentation. I'm going to include links to Y4Y social media accounts, so you can get involved with us. It includes our volunteering email, and it includes our info account email, which you can ask your questions that we hadn't gotten the chance to get to tonight. So I think that email really has it all. And on that note, thank you so much for attending. It was a pleasure to have you all, and we'd love to see you again in future events. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.